The hammer fell from Thomas Townsend's hand and struck the frozen ground with a dull, hollow sound, and for a long moment he could not breathe. Marcella Carter stood in the doorway of the ranch house with her traveling trunk behind her, her dark coat buttoned to the chin against the December cold, and her eyes were not angry. That was the worst part. They were resolved. The way a person's eyes look when they have already done their grieving in private and have nothing left to show you. "You said you were staying until spring," Thomas said, and his voice came out wrong, too quiet for a man who had spent the last 2 months building something with his bare hands that he had never built before, something that had nothing to do with wood or nails or the new room taking shape on the north side of the house. "I said I would stay the winter," Marcella told him. "Winter ends in 3 weeks, Thomas. I said what I said." He looked at the addition. The frame stood skeletal against the gray Montana sky, cross beams lashed and mortared, new pine planks stacked neatly against the outer wall of the original structure. He had started it the 3rd week of November, the same week she had laughed at his kitchen table for the first time and covered her mouth like laughter was something she was not permitted to own. He had told himself he was building a guest room. He had told himself a great many lies that season. "You don't have anywhere to go," he said, and hated himself for saying it the moment it left his mouth, because it sounded like a trap, and he was not that man. Marcella lifted her chin. "That is not the argument you want to make to me." "No," he said, "it isn't. I'm sorry." The wind moved between them. 3 weeks of hard Montana winter and a truth neither of them had spoken aloud, and now a trunk on a frozen doorstep, and a half-built room full of sawdust, and hidden motive, and something that felt very much like the end of everything before it had been given a proper chance to begin. He needed to tell her how he had arrived at this moment, and she needed to understand what she was walking away from. But the only way either of them could understand any of it was to go back to the beginning, to the October morning, when the stagecoach from Billings had deposited Marcella Carter on his property like a letter that had been addressed to someone else, and delivered to him by divine accident. She had not been expected. That was the essential truth of it. She had not been expected at all. The autumn of 1883 had come hard and fast to Custer County, Montana Territory. The cattle markets in Billings had collapsed 2 seasons prior, the drought of '81 had taken half of Thomas Townsend's herd, and the bank note on the south pasture was overdue by 40 days. Thomas was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and deliberate in the way that men become when they have been doing difficult things alone for too long, and he had learned not to want things he could not afford to want. His nearest neighbor, a widow named Agnes Prout who ran 30 head on the adjacent property, had taken it upon herself the previous spring to write to a placement service in St. Louis on Thomas's behalf. She had done this without telling him. She had listed him as a widower, which was not quite accurate, since Thomas's wife Alina had not died but had left him in the summer of 1880, taking their infant daughter to her sister's house in Denver and filing papers that arrived 6 months later by post. He had signed them in the kitchen without ceremony and gone back out to mend fence. Agnes had described Thomas as steady, God-fearing, prosperous, and kind. 2 of those 4 things were entirely true. The placement service had matched him with a schoolteacher from Philadelphia named Helen Morse, and Helen Morse had written him 4 letters over the course of the summer, each one more measured and practical than the last, which suited Thomas because he was a measured and practical person, and had convinced himself that was all he needed. They had agreed that she would come in October and see whether the arrangement suited them both. She would teach at the schoolhouse in Harlow Creek during the week and board with Thomas on weekends, and if by spring they had decided the match was acceptable, they would marry before the summer. What had arrived on Thomas's property on the 14th of October was not Helen Morse. The stagecoach driver, a sunburned man named Court, had handed down first a large trunk, then a carpet bag, and then a woman who was clearly not in any distress about having arrived in the wrong place, even though she had clearly arrived in the wrong place. "This is the Townsend property?" she asked, looking at the house with the expression of a woman taking accurate inventory. "It is," said Thomas, because it was. "Marcella Carter," she said, and extended her hand in the way that a man would, straight out, no hesitation. "I'm the replacement. Helen Morse broke her engagement to you 4 weeks ago." "Did they not write to inform you?" Thomas said they had not. Marcella nodded as if this were entirely predictable. "The service is not well organized. Helen met a banker in St. Louis and reconsidered. They sent me in her place. I have my teaching credentials and my references from the service." She reached into her carpetbag and produced a folded envelope. "I understand if you want me to return to Billings on the next coach. That runs on Thursdays." "Wednesdays," said Thomas, who was staring at the envelope and not at her, because looking at her directly felt like something he needed to approach carefully. "Wednesday, then. I'll need somewhere to sleep Tuesday night." She said it so plainly, so without drama or appeal, that Thomas found himself picking up her trunk before he had decided to pick up her trunk. He carried it inside. She followed. She looked at his kitchen, his sitting room, the bedroom door he left closed, and the cold hearth, and she said, "You haven't lit the fire yet today." "Been working the fence line." "I'll light it," she said, and went to the woodbox beside the hearth. And that was how Marcella Carter entered Thomas Townsend's life, by lighting a fire in a cold room and making it seem like the most natural thing in the world. She did not leave on Wednesday. Not because Thomas asked her to stay, though by Tuesday evening he had thought about asking and thought better of it. She did not leave because the school board in Harlow Creek, who were indeed in desperate need of a teacher since the previous one had married a rancher in October and relocated to his property 40 miles north, offered her the position the moment she presented her credentials. The board's chairman, a methodical man named Everett Crane, shook her hand in the street and offered her $12 a month and the use of the schoolhouse stove. "I'll need boarding," Marcella said. "Mrs. Prout takes boarders," Everett said. "I'm already at the Townsend place," Marcella said, which was true, and which committed Thomas to something he had not exactly agreed to but could not now dispute in public without appearing inhospitable. He rode home that evening slightly baffled and found his house smelling of cornbread and wood smoke, and Marcella at his table correcting what appeared to be a primer on arithmetic with a sharpened pencil and a cup of coffee, looking entirely at home. "I accepted the position," she said, without looking up. "I'll pay you $3 a month for the room. I'll cook 3 evenings a week and Sundays. I'll stay through winter and reassess in March." Thomas sat down across from her. He had a dozen things he could reasonably say, but what he said was, "The room needs a new latch, the old one sticks." "I noticed," said Marcella. "I fixed it with a bent nail. It will hold until spring." He looked at her then, really looked. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with a quality of stillness about her face that was not coldness. He would understand that distinction later, but was rather the stillness of someone who had learned to keep her interior life at some remove from public view. Her eyes were a clear, unsettling brown, the kind that seemed lit from within when the firelight caught them. She was not soft in the conventional way that people meant when they used that word about women. She was precise. She was self-contained. She was, Thomas would think much later, the most complete person he had ever met, and also clearly in possession of a dark past she had no intention of discussing. He said, "What brought you to the placement service?" She looked up. The pencil paused. "They had openings. Most women who go to a placement service are looking to marry." "Most women have fewer options than I do," she said, and returned to her arithmetic. He let it go. He had secrets of his own and no appetite for the kind of exchange that would require him to trade them. October moved into November, and the rhythm of the Townsend house changed in ways Thomas noticed but could not quite articulate. He had been alone for 3 years, excepting the hired hand Reuben, a Crow man in his late 30s who worked the cattle and slept in the small cabin near the barn, and had the diplomatic good sense to find Thomas's new arrangement entirely unremarkable. Reuben's wife, A quiet, capable woman named Dora brought eggs twice a week and had taken one long look at Marcella Carter and pronounced her, in Crow, a woman with sense. Thomas spoke enough of the language to understand this. He considered it high praise. The children of Harlow Creek adored their new teacher within a fortnight. She was demanding and fair, and had a way of explaining fractions using the ranch fence posts visible through the schoolhouse window that made them suddenly comprehensible to children who had been baffled by them for years. She rode Thomas's spare mare, a steady bay named Juniper, the 3 miles to town each weekday morning, and returned by late afternoon. She cooked on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays as agreed, and she cooked exceptionally well, which Thomas had not anticipated, and which bothered him in the vague way that unexpected good things sometimes do when a person has grown accustomed to expecting very little. He began finding reasons to be in the kitchen on her cooking evenings. He began finding reasons to linger at the table after supper on evenings when she read or wrote letters at the far end of the room, the lamp close to her shoulder, her face bent over the page in a posture of such concentrated private attention that he felt he was seeing something he had no right to see. He began chopping more firewood than 2 people could reasonably burn in a season. He was not, he told himself, falling in love with Marcella Carter. He was simply adjusting to the company. He had forgotten what company felt like, and the adjustment was taking longer than expected. That was all. In the 3rd week of November, he rode into Harlow Creek to buy lumber. He told Reuben he was expanding the storage room. He told the man at the lumber yard he needed framing timber and pine planks for a room addition, 12 by 14. He did not examine his own reasons too closely. He began building on a Saturday morning when the ground was still hard but not yet frozen through. The work was loud, methodical, satisfying in the way that physical labor is satisfying, when the mind is churning with things it cannot resolve. He dug the post footings, set the corner beams, and was laying the floor joists when Marcella appeared at the kitchen window and watched him for a long time without speaking. Eventually she came outside with 2 cups of coffee and stood in the November cold in her coat and her boots that were wrong for Montana city boots with a low heel that left her slipping on the frost every morning before she had learned the particular grip of the ranch house steps. "What are you building?" she asked. "Room addition," he said. She handed him the cup and looked at the framing. 12 by 14. "About that. That's a bedroom." He drank his coffee and said nothing. Marcella looked at the addition and then at him, and he could feel her sorting through the implications of it with the same methodical intelligence she applied to everything. He waited for her to say something that would require him to deny something. She didn't. "The footings should be deeper for Montana winters," she said. "Frost heave will shift them." He looked at the footings. She was right. "How do you know that?" "My father built 3 houses," she said. "I handed him tools." She went back inside. He dug the footings another 6 inches. It was Agnes Prout who said what everyone else was thinking, because Agnes Prout was a woman who did not allow awkward truths to remain unspoken. She came to call on a Thursday in late November, brought a jar of preserved plums, and sat at Thomas's kitchen table with Marcella, and spoke with the direct warmth of a woman who cared about the people involved in the conversation she was about to have. "He's building you a room," Agnes said. "He's building an addition," Marcella said, "for storage." Agnes looked at Marcella with the patient expression of a woman who has seen many things. "My dear, Thomas Townsend has had that storage room for 11 years and has never once seen fit to expand it. He started building the week after you arrived. He bought enough lumber for a permanent bedroom addition, not a storage closet. And if you look out that window on any given Saturday morning, you'll notice that a man who has 100 pressing ranch tasks finds the construction of that room more urgent than all of them." Marcella was quiet for a moment. "He is kind to offer more space." "He is in love with you," Agnes said pleasantly, and helped herself to a cup of coffee as though she had not just dropped a lit match into a powder keg. Marcella's face did something complex and quick that Thomas, had he been present, would have given a great deal to interpret. Instead, he was outside nailing pine planks in the cold, which was perhaps why she felt safe letting her face do what it did. "I told him the terms," Marcella said finally. "I stay through winter. What happens in spring? I reassess." Agnes nodded slowly. "And what would the reassessment require?" Marcella looked at her coffee. "Different circumstances than what I left." Agnes waited because Agnes understood that a woman with a dark past tells it on her own schedule. Marcella said, "I was engaged in Philadelphia 3 years ago to a man named Gerald Forsyth. He was an attorney, well-regarded, prosperous. We were to be married in April of 1881. In March of that year, I discovered that the prosperity was largely borrowed, that there were gambling debts amounting to sums I cannot name without feeling ill, and that 3 of the promissory notes bore my father's name as cosigner, which Gerald had arranged without my father's knowledge or consent, using documents he had prepared himself in his professional capacity." Agnes was very still. "My father died 6 weeks before the wedding," Marcella said, "of a heart episode that the doctor called natural, and that I have always believed was accelerated by the discovery of those debts, which reached him the same week. Gerald was convicted of fraud the following autumn. He is currently in the Eastern State Penitentiary." She said this in the tone of a woman reporting a weather forecast. "I spent the year after my father's death paying off what I could of what Gerald had borrowed in his name. I sold the house, our possessions, most of what was mine. When that was done, I had nothing left but my teaching credentials and a determination to be somewhere new, somewhere far enough from Philadelphia that no one would look at me with that particular combination of pity and appetite that people reserve for women who have been ruined by association." "You weren't ruined," Agnes said. "I know that," Marcella said. "But knowing a thing and being free of the way people treat you because of it are 2 different conditions." Agnes reached across the table and covered Marcella's hand with her own. "Thomas Townsend is not a man with hidden motives," she said. "He is a man who was left and who has been alone for 3 years, and who is currently building a room onto his house because you have somehow, in 6 weeks, made this place feel the way it was supposed to feel, and he doesn't know what else to do with that." Marcella looked at the window. Outside, the rhythmic sound of hammer strikes continued in the cold afternoon air. "I told him I would stay the winter," she said again, but this time it sounded less like a statement of fact and more like a question she was asking herself. December arrived and deepened, and the addition's frame filled in steadily. Thomas worked on it every Saturday and Sunday, and on the long evenings when the early dark of Montana winter drove him inside early from the ranch work, so that he began to work on the room by lamplight, his breath clouding in the unheated structure, Reuben sometimes helping with the heavier work, saying nothing, which was Reuben's way of saying everything was understood. Inside the house, something had shifted between Thomas and Marcella. Some degree of formality had dissolved without either of them having exactly agreed to dissolve it. She had begun saving him coffee in the mornings, knowing he came in from the early barn chores chilled through, and that he drank 2 cups before he was fit for conversation. He had begun, without comment, repairing the things in the house that had been broken and waiting for repair since Alina left: the stuck window in the sitting room, the warped board on the porch steps, the leaking joint in the stovepipe that left a faint smell of smoke in the kitchen on windy days. It was as though they were separately tending a thing without having agreed to tend it together. One evening in the first week of December, after supper, Thomas sat across from Marcella at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "I should tell you about Alina." Marcella set down her book. She gave him the kind of attention that made him understand why her students liked her, complete, unrushed, without judgment arranged in advance. He told her. He told her about meeting Alina Bassett in 1877 in Miles City, where he had gone to sell cattle, and she had been visiting her aunt, and how they had married quickly in the way that people marry in the territories when they are young, and there is no particular reason to wait. He told her that Alina was a woman of genuine good qualities, who had been persuaded by love and youth, and the romance of the frontier life, to marry a man who offered her a working cattle ranch and long winters, and very little of the society she had grown up expecting to be part of her life. He told her that the first winter had been hard, and the second harder, and that Alina had not been wrong to want more than what he could give her, only wrong to have believed she didn't want it before she had tried it. He told her about the baby, a girl named Clara, now 3 years old in Denver, who he had seen twice since Alina left, once when he had ridden down in the summer of 1881, and Alina had allowed him an afternoon visit, and once when Alina's sister had passed through Billings and brought Clara to the station platform while Thomas happened, by no coincidence, to be there. He told Marcella that Clara had his eyes and Alina's temperament, and that he sent money every month without fail, and had signed papers agreeing to Alina's terms because the alternative was a legal fight he did not have the money for, and that would have been worse for Clara regardless of the outcome. He said, "I don't tell people that part. Most of the county thinks Alina died." "Agnes told me," Marcella said. He looked at her, startled. "She wanted me to understand the full truth of the situation," Marcella said, "and there was no censure in it, only information. She said you were the kind of man who would let a comfortable misunderstanding persist rather than ask for the sympathy you were actually owed." Thomas looked at his hands on the table. "She's not wrong." "No," said Marcella, "she isn't." She paused. "I told her about Gerald." "I know," he said. "She told me." They looked at each other across the table, two people who had been reduced by betrayal and who had each, independently, decided that reduction was simply the new shape of things, and who were now sitting in a kitchen in Montana in December, discovering that the new shape might fit together with another new shape in a way that neither of them had expected. Thomas said, "The addition will be done by January." Marcella said, "You didn't have to build it." "I know. I told you I was only staying the winter." "I know that too." She looked at him for a long time. "Why are you building it?" he said. "Because every time I'm out there working on it, I feel like I'm doing something that matters, and I haven't felt that way about building anything in a long time." It was not, she understood, entirely about the room. The Christmas season in Harlow Creek was modest but genuine. The town had a church, a 2-story building that served also as the meeting hall, and the congregation organized a Christmas social on the 23rd of December, with fiddle music and dancing, and the consumption of quantities of Mrs. Alderman's famous apple brandy. Thomas owned one good coat and had it pressed. Marcella wore a dark red dress that she had brought from Philadelphia and had not worn since, and when she came out of her room in it, Thomas was standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression so unguarded that she looked away first. They rode to town in the wagon, close together because the bench was narrow and the night was cold, and she could feel the warmth of his arm against hers through their coats, and she found herself not shifting away from it. The social was bright and loud and full of people who were all, as far as Marcella could tell, genuinely pleased to see Thomas Townsend with a woman on his arm, and equally genuinely invested in whether the arrangement would become permanent. She had become known in the preceding 6 weeks as an excellent teacher and a sensible woman, and several ranch wives had formed the opinion that she was exactly what Thomas needed, and expressed this opinion to Thomas directly, which he bore with good grace. Everett Crane, the school board chairman, told Marcella that the board would like to offer her a permanent position if she intended to remain in Harlow Creek beyond the spring. "I'll let you know in March," she said. "The children are particularly fond of you," Everett said. "Young Billy Prout, Agnes's grandson, told his grandmother that you are the only teacher who has ever made him want to come to school." Marcella smiled. Billy Prout was 8 years old and had a reading difficulty she had identified in his first week, a confusion of letters that reversed themselves when he looked at them, and she had spent 2 extra hours a week with him alone, using a method she had read about in a journal from Boston that treated the reversal as a different way of seeing rather than a deficiency. He was now reading at grade level and had informed Marcella with great seriousness that he intended to be a surveyor, which required mathematics, which he was prepared to study if she continued to teach him. "I'll let you know in March," she said again to Everett, and went to find Thomas, who was standing at the edge of the dancing with a cup of cider and looking across the room at her with an expression she was beginning to catalogue. There was the expression he wore when she said something that surprised him. There was the expression he wore when she made him laugh, which was rarer because he was not a man given to laughter, but when it happened it changed his whole face. There was the expression he wore in the mornings across the breakfast table, which was the quietest and the most difficult to look at directly because it was the most honest. The expression he wore now across the Christmas social was the one she had been deliberately not naming. She crossed the room and stood beside him and said, "Dance with me." He looked briefly startled, then set down his cider cup, and she saw the careful way he placed his hand at her waist, like someone handling something he was afraid of breaking, and she thought with a clarity that arrived suddenly and without warning that she was in a great deal of trouble. They danced twice, and then the fiddle player, a bow-legged man named Hector who had been playing for celebrations in Harlow Creek for 20 years, switched to a slow air that was not strictly a dance tune, but which nobody seemed to mind, and Thomas and Marcella stood still on the dance floor, close enough that she could feel the slight tension in his arm where it held her. And she was absolutely not going to let herself be foolish about a man in Montana when she had come out here to be free and sensible and safe. She stayed for the slow air. She stayed for the two that followed it. On the ride home, the stars were ferocious overhead, the way they are in Montana in winter, crowded and indifferent and magnificent, and Marcella looked up at them and said, "I have never seen stars like that in my life." "Philadelphia has too much lamp oil," Thomas said. She laughed, unexpected, and it escaped before she could cover her mouth, and she let it go, let it rise up into the cold air above the wagon, and Thomas looked at her with that expression, and she thought about what Agnes had said about the room. "He is building you a room. He doesn't know what else to do with that." She looked at the sky and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not yet safety but was moving in that direction. 3 days after Christmas, everything went wrong. The letter came by the Wednesday post, which Thomas collected from the Harlow Creek postmaster on his supply run. There were 2 letters. One was from his bank in Billings, a notice that the note on the south pasture was now 60 days overdue, and that a representative would be sent in January to assess the property and discuss options. The second was from a man named Pierce Alderman, who was no relation to Mrs. Alderman of the Apple Brandy, but was rather a land speculator from Billings who had been, according to local knowledge, circling the ranches in the Harlow Creek area for 2 years looking for properties in financial distress. Pierce Alderman's letter offered to purchase the south pasture outright at a price that was fair by a depressed market standards, which meant it was not fair by any other standard, and suggested that Thomas could resolve his banking situation immediately by accepting. The south pasture was 200 acres of the best grazing land Thomas owned. Without it, the herd he could carry would be reduced by half. Without the herd he could carry, the ranch was no longer viable as a cattle operation. Without the cattle operation, there was no income, there was no mortgage payment, there was no property left within 5 years. Thomas came home and set the letters on the kitchen table and sat down and looked at them for a long time. Marcella came in from the cold at 4 in the afternoon, snow on her coat, cheeks red, already talking about a problem one of her older students was having with long division, and she stopped when she saw his face. She sat down. She read both letters. She was quiet for a long time. "How much is the note?" she asked. He told her. She was quiet again. Then she said, "What's the market value of a 2-year-old steer in Billings right now?" he told her. She took a piece of paper and a pencil and did arithmetic at his kitchen table with the same focused attention she gave to Billy Prute's reading difficulties. She said, "If you drove 40 head to Billings before the end of January, what would you net?" He looked at the numbers she was writing. "The drives in January are brutal." "I know. What would you net?" He took the pencil and added a column. He said not enough to clear the note entirely, but enough to buy another 60 days. And in 60 days, the spring market opens. Billings prices come up in March. You need to drive 40 head to Billings before the end of January, clear enough to buy 60 days, then drive again in March and clear the rest. He looked at her. "Reuben and I can't drive 40 head to Billings in January. It's a 4-day drive in good weather. In January it can be 8. Agnes Prute has 2 hired men who are between winter tasks," Marcella said. "I know because she mentioned it when I was over there last week. She would loan them to you for the drive if you asked her." "I can't ask Agnes for that." "Thomas." Her voice was steady and direct in the way it was when she was about to say something that needed saying. "Agnes Prute has been trying to help you for 3 years. She wrote the letter to the placement service because she wanted you to stop living like a man who has already decided he doesn't deserve good things. She would be genuinely honored to lend you 2 ranch hands for a cattle drive. The question is whether you are going to let your pride stand between you and your land." He looked at his kitchen. He looked at the window, and beyond it, the dark frame of the addition standing in the December cold. He looked at Marcella Carter, who had come to this place by accident and had fixed his latch and lit his fire and corrected arithmetic at his table and danced with him at Christmas, and who had told him she was leaving in 3 weeks. "I'll talk to Agnes tomorrow," he said. "Good," said Marcella, and handed him back his pencil. He went to Agnes the next morning, and Agnes said yes before he had finished asking, in the way that people say yes when they have been waiting for the question. Her 2 hands, brothers named Walt and Clem, who were large and experienced and cheerfully indifferent to difficulty, agreed to the drive with equal readiness. The drive was set for the 2nd week of January. Thomas and Reuben and Walt and Clem would take 42 head south to Billings, 4 days in good weather, 6 if the snow came hard. Marcella said she would manage the house and the horses and check the remaining cattle twice a day with Dora's help. Thomas spent the days before the drive preparing, selecting the animals, checking equipment, reviewing the route with Reuben, who had made this drive in winter before and was quietly confident. On the night before the departure, Marcella made a proper supper, roasted chicken and potatoes and a dried apple pie that required more effort than the occasion technically demanded, and they sat at the table and ate together in the comfortable silence that had grown up between them over the weeks, a silence that was not empty but full, a silence that meant they were easy with each other. He said, "If this goes wrong in Billings, I'll lose the south pasture." "It won't go wrong," she said. "You don't know that." "No. But I know that the man going to Billings is the man who fixed every broken thing in this house without being asked, who built a room addition in November because he wanted to, who rode out in the cold every morning to check cattle that didn't pay enough to justify the effort, who has sent money to Denver every month for 3 years for a daughter he barely gets to see because it's the right thing to do." She looked at him steadily. "That man doesn't fail the things he cares about." Thomas was very quiet for a moment. "Marcella, eat your pie," she said. He ate his pie. But he looked at her over the table with the expression she had been not naming, and she looked back at him with something she had been not naming either, and the lamp burned between them and the Montana winter pressed against the windows, and 3 weeks suddenly felt like a very short time. He left before dawn the next day. She was up to see him off, which she had not said she would be but which did not surprise either of them. She stood on the repaired porch steps in her coat and handed him a cloth-wrapped parcel of food for the trail and a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "The calculation," she said. "The numbers you need to get for the 42 head to clear the bank note in 2 drives. Don't take less than that per head, no matter what the buyer says." He looked at the numbers. They were exact, they were correct, and they assumed a slightly higher Billings price than he had been expecting, which turned out, when he checked the current posted rates on his arrival, to be exactly accurate. He put the paper in his breast pocket against his chest and rode out into the January dark. The drive took 6 days. The weather was hard on the third and fourth days. A steady cold wind out of the northwest that numbed the hands and pushed the cattle into restless clusters and required constant riding to keep them moving. Walt and Clem were everything Agnes had promised. Reuben was steady and expert. On the 6th day, cold and trail-sore and not fully rested, Thomas walked the 42 head into the Billings stockyards and spent 3 hours in negotiation with a buyer named Strand who opened low and moved incrementally upward over the course of the conversation in the manner of a man who had done this many times. Thomas held the price Marcella had written on the paper. He held it against Strand's skepticism, against Strand's alternate offer, against Strand's final expression of injured professional pride. He walked out with a bank draft that covered 1.5 times the minimum he had needed, was more than enough to address the overdue note, and left enough reserve to carry the property to the March drive without crisis. He went to the bank and addressed the note, and the banker, a florid man named Goss who had been looking forward to the January assessment visit, shook Thomas's hand with the undisguised disappointment of a man whose opportunity has just evaporated. Thomas rode home in 4 days because the weather had cleared. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon and Marcella was in the kitchen, and the house smelled of soup and bread, and when he came through the door she looked up from the stove and said, "The cattle are all accounted for. Juniper threw a shoe on Thursday but Reuben replaced it. There's a ewe in the near pasture that's been limping and needs looking at." "How much did the stockyard give per head?" she asked, because she had already read the answer in his face that he had done it, that the ranch was safe. He told her. She turned back to the stove, but not before he saw her face do the thing it had done in Agnes's kitchen, when Agnes said he was in love with her. The complex, quick thing that she usually kept out of public view. "Soup will be ready in an hour," she said. "Marcella," he said. She stirred the soup. "Thomas." "I held your price," he said. "The number on the paper, I didn't take less." "I know you didn't." He crossed the kitchen and stood close behind her, not touching, just present, the warmth of the cook stove and the smell of soup and the late afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, and he said very quietly, "I don't want you to go in March." She was still at the stove. Not frozen, not rigid, simply still, in the way she became still when she was thinking. "You told me you were only staying the winter," he said. "I understood that when you said it. I'm not asking you to go back on your word. I'm just telling you the truth. I don't want you to go." She turned around. She was close because the kitchen was not large and he had come to stand near the stove. She looked at him with those clear, lit-from-within eyes, and he held very still in the way a man holds still when he is afraid that any movement will disturb something delicate. "You built that room," she said. "Yes." "That wasn't storage." "No." "It was never going to be storage." "No," he said. "It wasn't." She looked at him for a long, careful moment. "I came here," she said slowly, "because I had nothing left and nowhere else to be. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was a temporary arrangement in a remote place where no one knew about Gerald and my father, where I could teach and save money and start again somewhere eventually. I told myself I was not going to want anything I couldn't be certain of." "And now?" he asked. "And now," she said, "I have a student named Billy Prout who is reading 3 months ahead of where he started, and I have a town that feels like it might be mine if I let it, and I have She paused and looked at her hands and then looked back at him. "I have a house that feels different than it should feel for somewhere I only plan to stay the winter." He waited. "Ask me," she said. He said, "Stay." She said, "Yes." He kissed her then, and it was the kiss of 2 people who have been careful for a long time and are now, carefully, being less so, which is its own particular kind of wonderful. The first week of February was the warmest of that winter, which is not to say it was warm, but the sun appeared consistently, and the snow softened during the middle hours of the day, and Thomas worked on the addition with the renewed energy of a man who now knows why he is building it. Reuben helped with the roof framing, and by the end of the week the structure was weathertight for the first time, the roof planks nailed down, and the window cut and framed, waiting for glass which Thomas had ordered from the Harlow Creek General Store. The addition was 12 by 14 feet. It had a south-facing window that caught the afternoon sun and a door that connected to the main house through what had been the back wall of the sitting room. Thomas had added a small iron heating stove, vented through the new roof, which made the room warm and private. He had built a bed frame from oak he had salvaged from a downed tree in the south pasture, mortised and pegged in the traditional way his father had taught him, and he had ordered a rope mattress from the Billings catalog. When the room was finished in mid-February, Marcella stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. It had a shelf along the south wall. It had 2 hooks by the door. It had a small writing table Thomas had built from leftover pine, sized precisely for one person to sit and work by the south window. The window glass had arrived and was set, and the afternoon light came through it and fell across the floor in a pattern that made the new pine glow gold. "You built the table for me," she said. "It's the right height for writing," he said. "I measured." She looked at him over her shoulder with an expression that was absolutely not the controlled, collected Marcella Carter expression. That was the Marcella Carter she was when she forgot to manage her own face. "Thomas Townsend," she said, "you are making it very difficult to maintain any pretense that this was ever a sensible arrangement." "It was always a sensible arrangement," he said. "Sensible people fall in love too." She turned around fully and looked at him, and the afternoon light was in the room, and the new stove was making a low, warm sound, and she said, "Is that what this is?" "That's what this is," he said. She crossed the room and put her hand against his chest and looked up at him and said, "I was so certain I was done with wanting things." "So was I," he said. "I'm not going to be easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I will correct your arithmetic. I will tell you when I think you're wrong. I need time to myself in the mornings before I'm fit for conversation." "I know," he said. "I've been living with you since October." "I'm serious, Thomas." "Marcella," he put his hand over hers where it rested on his chest. "I built you a room with a writing table at the right height. I think I know what I'm asking for." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she laughed, that real laugh that she had stopped managing to keep contained, and he thought it was the finest sound he had ever heard in a room he had built. They were married in March. It was not the elaborate production that Alina had wanted and that Thomas had never been equipped to provide. It was a simple ceremony in the Harlow Creek Church, conducted by the minister, a patient man named Reverend Cole, who had been hoping to officiate at Thomas Townsend's wedding for approximately 3 years, and was now doing so with barely concealed satisfaction. Agnes Prout cried, which surprised everyone including Agnes. Reuben and Dora attended, and Dora wore her good blanket and brought a gift of dried chokecherries, and traded something in crow with Marcella that made Marcella stand straighter and smile. Billy Prout was there because he had asked to be, and because no one could find a reason to say no. The wedding supper was at Thomas's house, which was now considerably more than Thomas's house, and Marcella stood in the kitchen and looked at the full table of people who had somehow become her people, in a place she had not expected to be her place, and felt the particular vertigo of finding yourself exactly where you are supposed to be when you had not planned to be there. Thomas stood beside her and said very quietly so only she could hear, "Agnes is going to try to give a speech." "She's already practiced it," Marcella said. "She told me." He looked at her. "She told you. We've been friends since November," Marcella said. "Did you not notice? I noticed you went over there a lot. We have very similar views on how stubborn men need to be managed." He looked at her with a mix of amusement and wariness that was, she had decided, one of her favorite expressions on his face. "Should I be concerned?" "Absolutely," she said, and kissed him on the cheek, and Agnes stood up and gave her speech, which was exactly as heartfelt and slightly long as promised, and everyone at the table was entirely glad to hear it. The spring came properly in April, and with it the second cattle drive to Billings, this time Thomas and Reuben with 60 head in good weather over 4 days. The Billings market had risen exactly as Thomas had calculated, and the drive netted enough to clear the remainder of the banknote on the south pasture and leave a reserve that Thomas had never had before, a number in a bank account that represented something other than just barely staying ahead. He came home and told Marcella the number, and she nodded and said, "That's enough to buy 10 breeding cows from the Harding operation before they sell in June." He said, "I was thinking 8. She said, 10. He bought 10. She was right, which did not surprise him. He had discovered that Marcella Carter, who had grown up in a city and had never raised cattle in her life, had a practical instinct for the economics of the business that she applied with the same clear-eyed thoroughness she applied to everything. She read the agricultural journals that arrived in Harlow Creek by post. She talked to other ranchers' wives at the mercantile and absorbed information about market trends and pasture management, with the attention of someone building a second expertise from nothing. She had no patience for doing something halfway. The summer of 1884 was the best Thomas could remember in years. The herd was healthy, the pastures green after spring rain, and the south pasture, saved from Pierce Alderman's appetite, carried the new breeding cows and the promise of a stronger herd next season. Marcella taught through May, then spent the summer at the ranch, riding Juniper every morning with a confidence that had grown from the tentative early winter seat of a city woman into something approaching genuine horsemanship. She and Dora had developed a friendship that operated in a mixture of English and fragments of Crow, and a shared pragmatic language of women who both knew what it was to manage a great deal with very little complaint. In August, Marcella told Thomas she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast in her direct way, without preamble or ceremony, setting the fact down on the table between them like one of her arithmetic problems, something to be acknowledged and worked with. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before and catalogued immediately as one of her favorites. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm well," she said. "I'm healthy. The baby will come in late February or early March. I've already spoken to Mrs. Alderman, who has delivered a number of babies in this county, and she has agreed to assist." Thomas reached across the breakfast table and took her hand, and she let him, which she had learned to do without the instinct to withdraw and manage, and he said, "Marcella, Thomas, we're going to need a larger kitchen table," he said. She laughed, sudden and unguarded. "Eventually," she said. "Not yet," he considered. "I could build an extension off the south side of the kitchen." "You are absolutely not allowed to start another construction project," she said firmly. "Finish the fence repair on the east pasture first." He finished the fence repair first. He started the kitchen extension in October. The winter of 1884 was cold in the particular deep way of Montana winters that settle in and do not leave. The ranch house, now expanded and warmed by 3 stoves including the new one in the addition, was comfortable in a way it had never been when it was just Thomas alone in a space that was too large for one person, but not shaped right for the kind of living that requires 2. They spent the long evenings by the sitting room fire, Marcella with her books and letters, and the journal she had begun keeping, Thomas with the ranch accounts and the catalogs for spring equipment, and occasionally a novel that she would put in his hands with the quiet certainty of someone who knows what you need before you know it yourself. They talked, in the unhurried way of people who trust that there is time. They talked about Clara in Denver, and Marcella said one evening that if Alina ever permitted it, she would be glad to meet her, which Thomas received with the silence of a man who is unexpectedly moved by something and needs a moment before he can speak. He wrote to Alina in November, a careful letter in which he described his circumstances honestly, his marriage, the ranch's improved situation, and his continuing commitment to Clara's financial support. Alina wrote back in December, a letter that was brief, and Thomas thought, written by a woman who was herself in a better situation than she had been in 1880. She had remarried the previous year to a doctor in Denver, and the letter had a quality of general goodwill that earlier communications had lacked. She said she would consider a visit from Thomas the following summer. She did not mention Marcella directly, but she did not oppose her either. Thomas showed Marcella the letter. Marcella read it twice and said, "She sounds like she's all right." "I think she is," he said. "Good," said Marcella. "Clara should have a mother who is all right." This was, Thomas had learned, simply how Marcella operated. She did not waste energy on bitterness about things that had already happened and could not be changed. She looked at what was true and worked from there. It was one of the things he loved most about her. And love was a word he now used internally without ceremony or hesitation, the way you use words for things that have become simply true. The baby came on the 28th of February, 1885, arriving just barely before the winter's official end, in a timing that Marcella, recounting it later, found either cosmically appropriate or entirely coincidental, and she was willing to accept either interpretation. Mrs. Alderman came, and Agnes Prout came because Agnes was the kind of person who appears where she is needed without being specifically summoned, and Thomas paced the kitchen in a state of controlled but visible distress that Reuben, who had come to sit with him in solidarity, observed with the quiet sympathy of a man who has been through this himself. The baby was a boy. Thomas was allowed in after an hour, and he stood at the bedside of his wife, who was tired in the way of someone who has done something enormous and is not yet ready to process the full scale of it, and he looked at his son, a red-faced and emphatic small person wrapped in flannel, and he did not have words for what he felt. He had built things with his hands. He had driven cattle in January cold, and sat across from bankers and mended fence in all weather and been left, and come back from being left and been afraid and worked through the fear, and come out the other side of a winter he had not been sure he would survive in any meaningful sense. None of it had prepared him for this. "He has your jaw," Marcella said from the pillow. "He does not," Thomas said. "He absolutely does. It's that determined set. He's already annoyed about something." Thomas looked at his son's expression, which was indeed a very determined expression for a person who was 53 minutes old. "What do you want to call him?" Marcella had thought about this. "James," she said. "My father's name was James," Thomas said. "James Townsend. James Carter Townsend." She looked at him. "You don't have to use Carter." "I want to," he said. "It's his name too." She looked at him with the expression that was not the managed Marcella Carter face, and she said, "Come here." And he sat on the edge of the bed, and she put her free hand against his face in the particular way she did this, palm to cheek, which he had come to understand as her most unguarded gesture of tenderness, and she said, "I came here to stay the winter." "I know," he said. "You built an addition." Several at this point. She laughed, low and exhausted and real. "Thomas Townsend, I am deeply, completely in love with you, and I want you to know that I intend to tell you so regularly, because I spent 3 years being careful about wanting things, and I have decided that was a waste of time." He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm. He said, "I love you. I have loved you since November, when you told me my footing depths were wrong and you were right." "Earlier than that," she said. "The footings were late October." "You know when I started building," she smiled, eyes closing with tiredness. "You started building the day after Agnes told you she thought I was going to stay. He hadn't known she knew that. She told you." "Agnes tells me everything," Marcella said, and was asleep within minutes, and Thomas sat on the edge of the bed with his son in his arms and watched the February light come through the window of the room he had built, and felt the precise, quiet fullness of a life that had become exactly what it was supposed to be. Spring came, and with it the season's work, and the baby fit into the rhythm of the ranch house with the adaptability that babies have, which is not that they are easy, but that they rearrange everything around themselves, and this rearrangement, in a house where both parents are capable and sensible and entirely committed to the project, becomes simply the new way things are. Marcella returned to teaching in April, bringing James to Dora in the mornings and returning by mid-afternoon, an arrangement that suited everyone including Dora, who had raised 3 children and found James a sensible and interesting infant. Billy Prout, who was 9 now and reading ahead of his grade, informed Marcella in April that he had heard there was a new baby at the Townsend place, and that babies were a significant responsibility, which he reported with the tone of a person who had given the matter careful consideration. Marcella told him he was correct, and that James would one day be old enough to need instruction in reading, at which point Billy's experience would be invaluable. Billy considered this for a week and came back to report that he was available for this purpose. In June, Thomas made the trip to Denver. He went alone, by train from Billings, a journey that took 2 days and felt very long when he thought about Marcella and James at the ranch, and very short when he thought about what was waiting for him at the other end. Alina met him at a restaurant near the train station, a respectable establishment that indicated a degree of formality appropriate to the occasion. She was 32 and composed and married to her Denver doctor, and clearly in a life that fit her better than the ranch in Montana had ever done. Thomas felt no anger encountering this. He felt, if anything, something like relief. They talked for 2 hours. Alina's husband had been willing to bring Clara to the restaurant for the last hour of the visit, and so Thomas met his daughter properly for the first time, a 4-year-old with dark hair and sharp eyes who looked at him with the direct evaluation of a child deciding what to make of a stranger, and then, without particular ceremony, climbed onto the chair beside him and told him about a dog she had seen that morning. He listened to every word she said. He returned to Harlow Creek carrying a small paper portrait that Alina had allowed Clara to give him, a drawing Clara had made herself at the restaurant with a pencil, and paper Alina had brought specifically for this purpose, which told Thomas something important about Alina's state of mind regarding the visit. He put the portrait on the shelf in the main room, where it stayed. He wrote to Alina afterward to thank her. Alina wrote back to say that quarterly visits seemed reasonable if the train journey could be arranged, and that she would consider bringing Clara to Montana the following summer to see where she had been born. She also mentioned, carefully and without pressure, that Clara had asked about Marcella and that Alina had told her Marcella was a teacher, which Clara had found interesting. Marcella read this letter and said, "We should write to Clara." Thomas looked at her. "Would that be Clara is your daughter?" Marcella said. "She should know the people who are part of her father's life. We should write to her. Age-appropriate letters, not complicated. Tell her about the horses. Children like horses." They wrote to Clara together the following Sunday. Marcella drafted it. Thomas checked the details, and they included a small drawing Thomas made of Juniper, which was not an expert drawing but was recognizable as a horse. Clara's reply, dictated to Alina, arrived 6 weeks later and said that the horse had a nice face and that she wanted to know if the baby could talk yet. James could not yet talk but was making very determined and purposeful sounds that suggested he had strong opinions about the immediate future. The summer of 1885 was prosperous in a quiet, sustaining way. The herd was the strongest Thomas had run in years. The breeding cows Marcella had insisted on buying had produced well, and the south pasture carried a full complement of cattle with grass to spare. Thomas paid down a further portion of his operating debt and built the reserves to a point where the kind of crisis that had nearly taken the ranch the previous winter was no longer an immediate threat. He also built the kitchen extension he had started in October, completing it in July, which gave them a kitchen large enough for the table that now had James's high chair at one end and would, Marcella had noted, accommodate the larger gatherings she had begun to enjoy organizing, Sunday dinners that included Agnes and Reuben and Dora, and sometimes Everett Crane and his wife Bertha, who were quiet but pleasant people, and Billy Prout's family when Agnes brought them. Thomas looked at his table full of people on a July Sunday, the windows open on the summer evening, the sound of Reuben and Walt trading stories on the porch, James in Dora's arms making his purposeful sounds at the conversation, Marcella at the head of the table she had claimed as her own, because She was the one who organized these evenings, and it was her table as much as his. Laughing at something Agnes said with the full, unguarded laugh that he had first heard in a wagon under Montana stars. He thought about the October morning she had stepped off the stagecoach and introduced herself and told him the next coach ran on Thursdays. Wednesdays, he had said. Wednesday, then. I'll need somewhere to sleep Tuesday night. He had picked up her trunk before he had decided to and had carried it inside, and she had lit his cold fire, and the rest of it had followed from there in the inexorable way that the right things follow when you let them. Agnes caught his eye across the table and smiled, not the smile of someone who is saying "I told you so," though she was entitled to that, but the smile of someone who is simply and genuinely glad. In the autumn of 1885, a situation arose in Harlow Creek that tested the community in a way Thomas and Marcella had not anticipated. A group of settlers had arrived in the area over the summer, a rough collection of men with a land claim agent who was asserting rights to territory that bordered the grazing land traditionally used, if not formally owned, by Reuben's extended community. A group of Crow families who had been ranging through this valley for many years and who had an arrangement with the existing ranchers, including Thomas, that was based on long-standing good faith rather than formal legal documentation. The land agent's name was Coburn, and he was the kind of man who understands that rights on paper frequently override rights in practice, which is not the same as rights in justice, and who has made his professional career on this distinction. He arrived at Thomas's property in September to introduce himself and to suggest, pleasantly, that the Crow family's use of certain grazing routes might need to be formally curtailed to avoid confusion with the new settlers' claims. Thomas listened to this with the specific patience of a man deciding how to respond to something that offends him, without giving the offensive thing the satisfaction of visible anger. Then he said, "Those families have had an arrangement with me and my neighbors for 11 years. Reuben, who works my ranch and has done for 7 years, is part of that community. Any curtailment of their traditional routes would require discussion with all the affected ranchers in this valley, and I can tell you now that Agnes Prout, who has been ranching adjacent to me for 15 years, will not receive your suggestion well." Coburn had expected less resistance and adjusted his approach. He left. Thomas rode to Agnes. Agnes received Coburn's suggestion exactly as predicted. She then rode to 3 other ranchers, and within a week there was a formal meeting in the Harlow Creek Church, not a confrontational one but a very definite one, at which the ranchers of the valley agreed collectively to document, in writing, their existing arrangements with the Crow families, and to present this documentation to the Territorial Land Office in Billings as evidence of established and good faith use, which carried legal weight under the existing territorial codes. Marcella drafted the documents. She did this in 3 evenings at the writing table by the south window, using the precision of her teaching background and what she had read about territorial land codes, and she produced something that the Billings Land Office found sufficiently sound to require Coburn settlers to seek a different route of access for their claims, one that did not impinge on the documented arrangements. It was not a perfect outcome. It was not justice fully served, because the history of what had been taken from the Crow people and from the various nations of that territory was vast and deep and older than Harlow Creek, and older than any document Marcella could write. But it was a preservation of what could be preserved in this moment with these tools, and Reuben, when Thomas told him what had been done, was quiet for a long time and then said, in the careful English he used when he wanted something to be exactly understood, "Thank you, Thomas." Thomas said, "Marcella wrote the documents." Reuben nodded. "I know, Dora already thanked her." Dora's thanks had, Marcella reported, included a long conversation in which Dora had told her that the Crow word for someone who does the right thing without being asked carries a particular weight, and that she had used it in reference to Marcella, and that Marcella could consider this a significant designation. Marcella had asked Dora to teach her the word. Dora had, and then taught her 3 others, and they had talked until the winter dark came down. The winter of 1885 was the second winter Marcella spent at the ranch, which was now simply her home, and it was different from the first winter in all the ways that 2 things can be different when the surface is similar, but the foundation has changed entirely. She was no longer a woman with a trunk and a conditional arrangement. She was a woman with a husband who built things with his hands, because it was how he expressed what he felt, and a son who had begun saying recognizable syllables and had chosen as his first clear word a version of Reuben's name that emerged as something resembling Reuben, which delighted Reuben and became a household joke. James said Mama clearly at 10 months and Papa at 11, and by 12 months had added something that sounded like cookie and something that sounded like horse, which Thomas took as evidence that the child had correct priorities. Clara came to Montana in the summer of 1886. Eleanor brought her on the train to Billings, accompanied by Eleanor's sister, and Thomas met them at the station, and Clara was 5 now, a complete and opinionated person who looked at Montana with the measuring eyes of someone taking serious stock. She looked at Marcella with the same directness. Marcella crouched to Clara's level and said, "Hello. Your father has told me a great deal about you. He drew me a picture of you once from memory, and he got your hair right but your nose wrong. I'll show you." Clara said, "He draws horses badly too." "He does," Marcella agreed. "Shall we go see the actual horses? Juniper is particularly good-natured," Clara considered. "All right," she said, and took Marcella's hand in the matter-of-fact way of a 5-year-old who has decided to trust someone. And Thomas stood at the Billings station platform and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since 1880. Clara spent 2 weeks at the ranch. She and James, who was now 16 months and moving through the world at considerable speed and volume, achieved a cautious partnership that involved Clara deciding what they were going to do and James following with enthusiasm and no discretion. Clara rode Juniper with Thomas's hands on the reins and declared it satisfactory. She helped Marcella with the school primers Marcella was updating for the fall term and told Marcella that the fractions section needed more examples, which Marcella found deeply gratifying coming from a 5-year-old. Eleanor came to the ranch for one afternoon, brought by Thomas in the wagon. She stood in the kitchen that Marcella had expanded and organized and made entirely her own, and she looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked at Marcella and she said, "Clara is happy here." "She is welcome here," Marcella said. "Always." Eleanor looked at her with the eyes of a woman making a final accounting of something. Then she nodded once, which meant more than it appeared to mean, and they had coffee at the kitchen table and talked about Clara's schooling in Denver and the merits of various arithmetic approaches, and parted with a handshake that was, for what it represented, a remarkable thing. The agreement that came from that afternoon, not written, not formal, but held between 4 adults with genuine intent, was that Clara would come to Montana each summer for as many summers as she wished, and that Thomas would go to Denver each spring, and that the people in her life would treat each other with the respect owed to people who are all, in their various ways, trying to do right by a child. Clara came every summer until she was 17 and came of her own fully choosing, by which point she was also writing letters to James, who was 11, and had developed into a serious, mechanically inclined boy who had dismantled and successfully reassembled the kitchen clock at age 9, and was currently engaged in a project involving the new electric telegraph equipment he had read about in a catalog, and was attempting to replicate with materials available in Custer County, Montana. But those summers were still to come on the afternoon in February of 1887 when Marcella told Thomas at breakfast that she was pregnant again. He set down his coffee. He looked at her. He said, "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said, "the same as last time at first. Mrs. Alderman said she expects it will go easily." He said, "I love you." She said, "I know, I love you too. Are you going to start building something?" He thought about it seriously. "The barn needs a new loft. Then build the loft, she said, but finish the east fence repair first. I finished that in November. Then the north fence, Marcella, Thomas. He built the barn loft in March, ahead of the second baby's arrival, because the barn loft genuinely needed doing, and because Marcella was right that the practical work was the right order of things, and because building was how he processed joy in the same way it was how he processed longing, which were not so different in the end, just the same need to make something real out of what felt too large to hold. The second baby came in October of 1887 and was a girl, red-haired like no one on either side of the family, which was a biological mystery Thomas found entertaining and Marcella found suspicious, until she remembered her grandmother in Philadelphia who had been red-haired and formidable. They named her Ruth Agnes, the Agnes for reasons that required no explanation. Agnes Prout received this news and cried, which was becoming a pattern, and said that the child was named after the wrong person because it should have been Marcella who had the honor. And Marcella told her that the honor was hers to bestow, and she was bestowing it on Agnes, which silenced Agnes for approximately 45 seconds, which was notable. Ruth Agnes Townsend grew up in the house her father had built and kept building, in the valley her mother had chosen to stay in when she had every reason to leave, in the community that had become theirs in all the ways that matter, through the difficult seasons and the good ones, through the cattle drives and the land disputes and the Christmas socials and the long winters that were not hardship, but simply the shape of the life they had chosen. Thomas and Marcella were, in all the ways the word applies, happy. Not in the easy way, not in the uncomplicated way, because nothing real is uncomplicated, but in the sustaining way, the way that is built rather than found, the way that requires two people to show up every day and choose the same thing they chose the day before, and know that the person across the breakfast table is doing the same. Marcella taught at the Harlow Creek School for 22 years. She updated the curriculum 4 times, introduced a library corner using books she ordered from a catalog in Chicago, and was responsible, by her own conservative count, for the education of 243 children, of whom a significant number went on to higher schooling that they might not otherwise have considered. Billy Prout became a surveyor. He came back to Harlow Creek in 1897 and brought his wife to meet Marcella, and told her that the reason he had gone to university was because she had spent 2 hours a week with him when he was 8 years old, and called his particular way of reading a different way of seeing rather than a fault, which he had believed, and which had made all the difference. He said this standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, in the direct way she had taught him, and Marcella received it with the quiet gratitude of someone who has spent her life doing work she believes in and does not always know the reach of. Thomas ranched the Townsend property for 40 years from the day he first claimed it. He expanded the herd, improved the pasture, paid off every debt, and left the land to James in 1903 in better condition than he had received it, which was, he said, the only thing he had ever aimed at. James was 23 by then, mechanically expert, sensible in the way of his mother, and determined in the way of his father, and had married a girl from Miles City the previous year who had her own strong opinions about ranch management, which Marcella found enormously encouraging. Ruth Agnes, at 16, had announced that she intended to study medicine. This was 1903, and it was not an easy announcement in any territory, but it was made with the particular quality of resolve that the Townsend women had in common, and Marcella and Thomas sat across from each other after Ruth had gone to bed, and Thomas said, "Where would she go?" "The Women's Medical College in Philadelphia still accepts students," Marcella said. "I've already written to request the application." Thomas looked at her. "When did you write?" "Last month," Marcella said. "When she told me she was thinking about it, I wanted to know the options before she asked." Thomas smiled, slow and complete. "Of course you did." Ruth Agnes went to Philadelphia in 1904, a journey that Marcella made with her, accompanying her daughter to the city she had left in 1883, and finding it changed and unchanged in the particular way of cities and of one's own history. She took Ruth to the neighborhood she had grown up in, showed her the school where she had first taught, stood for a quiet moment outside the building where her father's law office had been before Gerald Forsyth had made it impossible to say the name without pain, and found that the pain had reduced over 20 years to something bearable and historical, something that had happened to a different version of herself, and had ultimately driven that version to a stagecoach and a cold October morning in Montana. She came home to Thomas in October, and he met her at the Billings station, and she stepped onto the platform, and he was there with the look on his face that she had been cataloging since 1883, and she walked to him, and he held her, and she said into his shoulder, "It was good to go. It was better to come back." He said, "It always is." They rode home in the evening. The Montana sky was enormous and dark and full of the same ferocious stars she had seen from a wagon on Christmas Eve of 1883, and she looked up at them and felt the warmth of his arm against hers on the wagon bench, exactly as she had felt it that first time. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a trunk and a conditional agreement, and a determination to want nothing she could not be certain of. She looked at the house as they came up the drive, lit from within, James and his wife inside, probably, and Reuben's cabin warm and glowing near the barn, and the addition Thomas had built in November of 1883 now integrated so fully into the structure of the house that it was impossible to see where the original house ended and the built thing began, which seemed to her exactly correct. "Thomas," she said, "Marcella, I'm glad I stayed the winter." He pulled the horses to a stop in front of the house. He looked at her in the starlight, this woman who had come by accident and stayed by choice, who had told him the truth at every turn, and corrected his arithmetic and fixed his broken latch with a bent nail before she had any reason to fix anything of his, who had written land documents and raised his children and taught the children of his county, and built a life here with the same methodical, thorough commitment she brought to everything she cared about. "I'm glad you stayed every winter," he said. She kissed him there in the cold dark, under the Montana stars, in front of the house he had kept building because she kept giving him reasons to, and the light was on inside, and their people were in there, and the land was sound, and the life they had made was whole. She had told him she would only stay the winter. He had started building an addition. And 20 years later, standing in the December cold of 1903, looking at a house that had grown room by room into something neither of them could have imagined alone, Thomas Townsend thought that some things can only be understood in hindsight, that the room he had started nailing together in the November cold of 1883 had never been about storage, had never been about providing more space, had been from the first swing of the first hammer an act of faith. The kind that you make before you can prove it is warranted, the kind that says I believe this is worth building even though I cannot guarantee the outcome. Marcella had taught him that, not with words. With a bent nail and a lit fire and a cup of coffee in the November cold, with her hand against his cheek and her laugh under the stars, and her pencil moving across paper at his kitchen table on a winter evening, sure and clear and entirely at home. The house stood in the Montana dark, warm and lit and full of the sounds of living, and outside it the frozen ground held everything Thomas had built, all the rooms and all the fences and all the corrals, all the careful and faithful work of 40 years, and none of it, not one board or beam or mortise joint, meant as much as the woman inside who had stayed when she might have gone, who had chosen when she might have left, who had made this ordinary life extraordinary simply by being herself within it. Thomas put his horses in the barn and walked back across the frozen ground to his front door and opened it and went in out of the cold. Marcella looked up from her book by the fire. "There you are," she said. "Here I am," he said, and hung his coat and sat in the chair across from her, and the fire was warm and the house was whole, and it was winter and she was staying.